Hello and welcome to Beyond Our Patterns, a podcast in which we navigate the journey of breaking free from personal patterns and improving communication skills. We're your hosts, Claudia
and Vlad. Here, we'll be having candid discussions about personal development, communication, and ways of relating, romantically and otherwise. Today, we're experimenting with a slightly different setup, slightly less scripted and more free-flowy conversation to see where it goes. We'll try to have a bit of a structure in the sense of the topic, which is moving beyond labels. And then within that, we'll see where it evolves.
Yeah, and I think it's a really exciting conversation for us right now because it feels almost like a stock take of our own relationship. It's nice because the first conversation we've had on this podcast was about why poly, and we kind of discussed where we started. Then we talked about container-based conversations and a big, shift that we went through in our relationship, and now we're going through another shift, which is trying to move beyond labels. What does that mean to you, Vlad?
So, yeah, great question. I think labels are ultimately just shorthands that we use to delineate some concept from another. And in particular, in relating, it's just a really quick way of saying, the classic, I don't know, you want to go and date someone and they're like, I have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner. And we by default assume that means they're in a monogamous relationship, which prevents them from, let's say, seeing you. And oftentimes it's used as this kind of like go-to thing, right? While actually it might mean completely different things for different people. And I think there's a lot of labels that are really helpful, but then there's a lot of ways in which they can become unhelpful when you try to move into very kind of authentic relating. And then you actually realize that you might have defined the same word slightly differently. And then you're actually talking about different things, but you think you're talking about the same thing. So it feels like you're disagreeing.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, even in what you just said, you use labels to help you explain other concepts, right? So you said as you're moving into authentic relating, that's a label in itself.
Yeah.
So I think what is helpful about labels is that they help you encapsulate a bigger concept so that you can make a different point, right? So from this perspective, I guess labels are very helpful. I guess they're also helpful from the perspective of belonging to a community.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a shared identity around a label, then that limits a degree of introduction that you need to do and make for each other. For the LGBTQ community that works, but it also works for, I don't know, being an accountant.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I'm an accountant too. Like, we'll get on let's go get a pint at the pub and talk about accounting. Don't do that.
Can you tell that we sit in London, United Kingdom? Go for a pint in a pub.
With an accountant.
Wow. It's been 3 episodes and here we are. Pint in a pub. Anyway, you were saying.
No, that's it. I think they help us recognize things. And then on the flip side, as you were already mentioning as well, they can also encapsulate you in a box. So then it becomes restrictive and limiting in terms of what you might really consider yourself or what you might truly relate to. I think we're such complex human beings. Well, humans are complex beings. It can be quite hard to just enclose ourselves in a couple of labels. But we often try. Actually, I would be curious, what labels do you resonate with?
I would say I'm trying not to encapsulate myself in labels too much. And I think to me, it's kind of difficult territory from the perspective of you can start deconstructing to the level of, I don't want to identify as a man. I don't want to identify as a woman, as like my sexual orientation, my relationship status, my job. And then it's like, okay, then it just becomes really hard to have a conversation because ultimately what I'm trying to do is, let's say I'm getting to know you. I'm trying to create some approximation of who are you like as a person. And I think there's a degree to which we need to move away from that to really relate to each person as their own being without creating, oh, you're an accountant, so let me like download all the assumptions I have about accountants.
Yeah.
And now I've put you in a box and now, oh, you're also a man and you're also gay. Okay, like here's all the things that I think about that. And simultaneously though, I think when everyone's really rejecting any kind of label, you very quickly move into territory where it becomes like hard to have these conversations because you're so scared of putting on a label that might be offensive, but then you're just kind of like really sidestepping any questions that might relate to identity. And so I think to me, it's about being okay with whatever labels are put on me because maybe people use them to simplify their life, but then trying not to identify to labels myself and actually relate to myself within more than just kind of the label, right? While staying quite like anti-fragile from the perspective of if someone chooses to judge me for a certain quality, okay, like it talks more about them than about me. To reel it all the way back to relationships, I guess, I'm curious, what do you view as like helpful and unhelpful labels within the relationship realm?
Yeah, I mean, I do think relationship status in some way helps you communicate your degree of availability, your willingness to relate with someone. You know, having been in monogamous, having been in polyamorous relationships, I think it was just a shorthand of, you know, are we on the same wavelength? But at the same time, see, and that's the tricky thing, that's the nuance that I would really love to explore with you, because I think I have been someone who quite strongly associated with the label poly, right? Polyamory. So when we started discussing, you know, what's a relationship and, okay, we're polyamorous, what does it mean? What are our boundaries? How do we may want to shift them given our changing, you know, life needs, etc. I started feeling like my identity was being undermined, right? Because I really associated myself with the label of poly, but I also associated the label of poly with so many other things. I associated it with my politics, with my values, with the kind of communities that I was part of, and therefore it felt like moving even a degree away from being poly moved me away from being me. And I really like what you're saying about, you know, okay, labels may be helpful signposts, or it may be a helpful sign for, you know, just for a conversation or to help relate to someone or something. But we cannot forget that it's only a shorthand. It's not who we really are. And I think that's quite a journey that I'm on right now. So when you ask what labels are helpful, which ones are not, I actually would say they're helpful to a degree, past which they're not. And I think that degree is exactly what you said, which is the moment you start identifying with them way too much.
Yeah. And I think then you create a lot of kind of expectations on yourself and on others of, to fit with this label, you have to act X way. And if you act another way, you're like undermining the label. But truthfully, I think we need to not forget that it's just a shorthand, right? And it helps in some situations and it doesn't help in others. And I think for me, for example, it was really interesting observing you moving away from and so where we are right now is we try to not even call ourselves like monogamous or poly. There's also all these differentiations of like monogamish and polyamorish and so on. And within polyamory, there's open this way, open that way, you know, hierarchical, non-hierarchical. And again, it's a plethora of labels. And I think it helps to study them to understand what people refer to. Because as you say, which I super agree with, underneath these labels are oftentimes values or concepts that are important. So for example, I'm guessing, but probably part of the reason it was difficult for you to move away from polyamory, let's say put aside the politics of it for a second, it's probably the value of freedom. It's probably the value of like really open and transparent communication that's very mature. It's probably the not like needing to make pleasure guilty and so on. And maybe kind of renunciation of the concept of the one and things like that. And so I think if we do the effort to deconstruct what the values are, then especially in close relationships, it becomes easier to relate from a place of, here are the values that we align on versus here's how we label ourselves. And then what might end up happening is that you end up between labels, or that you're shifting from one label to another, which, as you're saying, can be quite a difficult thing. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, because I think there's a lot of attachment in society to like being loyal to the label as well, of like, oh, if you move from being a Democrat to a Republican, like, oh my God, you know, you've just kind of like reshape your whole identity, while truthfully you might just be, I don't know, moving around based on the currently available candidates and their politics. And similarly with relationships.
Absolutely. And I think on that point, it also makes me think about how labels can also actually be a little lazy, because they somehow allow you not to have that conversation about what your values really are. And again, let's we can leave the Democrat Republican debate out of it. But you know, what you're really interested in is asking, what do you believe? You know, what values do you stand for? What stands behind it? And I think when we, as you said, when we started having much more of these conversations, it started becoming clear that the label then didn't matter so much. And I think what's also beautiful as a side result of this is that you connect with someone much more deeply, you know? Rather than staying settled on, okay, this is my friend who is XYZ label, you ask them with curiosity, like, hey, what does that mean to you? Because actually, the definition of different labels can also vary across people. People can have a very different perspective on what it means to be poly, because there are so many different poly structures within that. And then, of course, you can go label after label after label, or you can, you know, you can try to bring it back to like, what do you care for in a relationship? What does it matter to you?
And I think like a really classic conversation for me around this is, let's say, if we're in a, you know, before I was poly, there was this delineation between, okay, we're seeing each other, now we're dating, now we're exclusive, and now we're boyfriend, girlfriend / partner, right? And I'm saying boyfriend, girlfriend because I was in straight relationships, but it's just very interesting that even within that, it's not very clear what these things mean, and they mean different things for different people. And there's the whole, let's just not talk about it. And especially, I think, in a lot of the dating world that I've seen, it's the whole, until we've said we're exclusive, you just assume you're not exclusive, but not everyone does. And a lot of people get hurt because you're too worried about having that conversation and coming across like too strong. And then there's just so much miscommunication, and there's so much, I think every miscommunication is an opportunity to get to know each other better. And instead of viewing it as such as like, hey, I just ask you a question because I'm curious, we often load these questions with expectations of, there's only one right answer to this question, and if you give me the wrong one, goodbye, instead of saying, oh, how interesting, I disagree, can we compromise, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think we often don't think about compromising on the definitions of shared concepts, you know? I think we often think like, oh, well, you know, you were texting this girl late at night, like you cheated on me.
Mm-hmm.
And the other person might be like, well, I haven't. I've just been texting because I'm getting to know someone. Like, who knows? Maybe we'll be friends. Maybe we won't. You don't know my intentions, right? So I think then, okay, so let's agree on what cheating means. What is your definition of cheating? To me, this really started in our relationship with the 5 pillars of connection that you have introduced to me through our coach.
Shout out to Sohail.
Yeah, we'll have him a lot more on this podcast for sure. So you brought to me this concept of, okay, so, you know, there's a framework of that every connection relies on 5 pillars. They are communication, honesty, respect, trust, and understanding. And I was like, okay, cool, that sounds easy. And then you said, we're going to rate them out of 5. Let's see where we feel we stand in our relationship. But before we do that, what does it mean to you to feel respected? What does it mean to you to trust? And it blew my mind a little bit. I was like, oh, I've never thought about defining such an obvious concept. But it's not that obvious, you know? Like, when you really start getting into it, what does it mean? Actually, Vlad, what does it mean to you to feel trust towards someone?
Before I answer that, I think the reason I did that was because when we were discussing that in my session with our coach, Sohail, he was, I think I kept saying, connection is so important to me, connection. And he's like, what does connection mean? And I was a bit taken aback and took a second and was thinking, wow, I've never really thought about this. And he said, it's quite funny that oftentimes the things that quote unquote matter to us the most are the ones we define the least. And to come back to your question, I think trust is where you can feel you can lean on someone, when you can feel that that person is going to be there for you and that there's a degree of safety within your relationship, that you can show something that they're not expecting and they will still be there and they'll not run away and they will give you a helping hand and not turn away. And I think that degree of safety then allows you to rely and trust the person. And as with all of these things, there's two ways. There's like, what does it mean for me to feel like I can trust you versus what am I doing to help you trust me? I think it's especially like relevant to respect, let's say, right? Like, when do I feel respected / like, how do I show respect? But with trust, it's also vice versa, like providing that level of loyalty so that the other person can feel like you're going to catch them if something happens, and you actually do.
Absolutely. In my coaching session, I also discussed how trust also has this element of non-control, this element of letting go. And there is a saying in Polish, ufać znaczy kontrolować, which means to trust means to control. And having grown up with that, I had some unpacking to do of the whole concept of trust and really leaning into it and trusting or relying on someone else to catch me when I'm struggling or when I need them or when something happens.
Yeah. In terms of coming back to the idea of labels, I think to me what would be interesting is I'd love to share a little story first from our relationship in terms of what was complex for me about certain labels. And then maybe we can also make it a bit actionable in terms of what are the things we do to actually move beyond labels. Because this is a really interesting philosophical discussion, but I think if any listeners are like, okay, cool, what does that mean? Right? Like, how do we apply this?
Absolutely.
I think in terms of the story, you had a bit of resistance to moving away from a label of poly, while I actually had resistance to attaching myself to a label, which I think we briefly discussed on our first podcast. But the whole idea of commitment, to me, had a lot of attachment to that, where it's like, okay, if we're committed, even though we're poly, it suddenly means, oh, we're, making long-term plans, and maybe we're throwing around words like, I was very adamant on like using the word life partner as in like we're not life partners and things like that. And it seemed that there were a lot of things attached to that, while actually what it meant for you is just a degree to which we're showing up in the moment, right? And so until we actually had that conversation and I said, here are all the things that trigger me about the word, you're not committed enough, we weren't able to move past that. And once we did, we realized that we're very much on the same page in the sense of being willing to invest in the relationship, being willing to be emotionally available, to spend the time. And I had nothing against any of these things, but because I had so many things attached to that label, suddenly I was like, I'd rather step away and, slam my foot on the brakes, because otherwise I'm gonna get pulled into something that I didn't anticipate. And I think there's so many things like that within the relationship world and outside of that world as well. But anything where you say something that implies a level of, especially if it's a level of constraint. So let's say if you become exclusive or monogamous versus if you switch between different polyamory dynamics, as soon as there's some limitation of freedom, that label oftentimes creates a lot more safety for the person who kind of wants that, and a lot more kind of unsafety from the person who feels constrained. So we had a little funny story. We were attending a workshop hosted by a friend called Almost Kissing. And at that point, we've already decided that we probably want to be in a more monogamous setup for the time being. And we're open to certain things, but more kind of together. And in that workshop, you basically almost kiss people, right? So you kind of go through several different stages of starting from kind of tracing each other's fingers through the air, and then building up the comfort and also the safety in saying no and kind of establishing your boundaries, and then kind of trying to experience that almost kissing, which was really interesting. And right before, we were like, okay, we're going to both attend and we're going to engage with different people. Where are the boundaries? And it was a really fun conversation, actually, but super important to create the safety where instead of saying, here's a label, we're now monogamous or poly or whatever, whichever one we would have picked, saying, okay, what does it like practically mean, right? So like, does licking count? Does biting count? and things like that. And it was really funny, but I think it's really important to break it down. And at that point, it doesn't feel like a label. It feels a lot more actionable. So I've already kind of started, but I'm curious, what do you think are good almost action steps if someone wants to assess how they move beyond their labels? And for the context of this, let's talk in relationship terms.
Yeah, so let me bring it back to a conversation that we had actually a couple of months ago, which kind of helped us move past the label of being poly. So at the time, we were after a pretty intense period of poly exploration, and being honest, polyamory does take quite a lot of emotional availability and attention. And then we looked ahead, we looked into our lives for the next few months, beginning of this year, and we knew that there was going to be a lot of uncertainty. We knew there was going to be a lot of shift and changes and things that will take our attention and new projects that simply needed to be prioritized. And we decided in that moment, maybe something needs to change. But instead of talking about actually in the beginning, we were saying, okay, so are we going to be poly, are we going to be monogamous, or are we going to be somewhere in between? We shifted that conversation to this, we put it to the side, and instead we focused on what is it that we're going to need from each other? How can our relationship best serve us? How can we best show up for each other? And also individually, what is it that that's going to support us best? And through that, we arrived at a place of saying, okay, well, our relationship actually will serve us best if it's a safe place where we can come back to and rest and recharge and hold each other and really be that supportive spirit from which we can then bounce back and face the music of our lives that's, pretty intense in its decibels right now.
I love that. Building on top of that, I think labels oftentimes create a certain expectation that they will last through time. So when you enter a certain relationship dynamic, for example, let's say you open up or you close down or you become exclusive or you become official, there's a lot of kind of, firstly, the implicit meaning attached to those things, which needs to be unpacked. But then also there's an expectation that will last. And so if you suddenly need to make a switch, it feels like quite a big, heavy thing to bring up. Like, hey, I don't really want to be exclusive anymore. Like it's not an easy conversation to have. While if you kind of move away from labels into what do I need to support me right now? What feels right? What feels aligned? Then there's a lot more room for kind of adjustment on the go and realizing that life is dynamic. Life is always changing. And you just need to keep being adaptable. And what we've observed in our relationship is it doesn't sacrifice the ability to last in a relationship. Actually, it feels a lot more, I wanted to say bearable, but I suppose exciting to imagine.
Thanks.
I can bear you for the rest of my life. But I think it becomes a lot more exciting for me to want to continue being in a partnership with you long term, knowing that if at some point we really need to switch our dynamic, that option's on the table, and you're not gonna, be at my throat if I suddenly come to you and say, hey, I actually would love to explore something with someone else. How would you feel about that? Or maybe we never do, or maybe we find compromise. And I think just having that openness allows us to not create these expectations through time and being like, this works right now, we'll see what happens next. And
exactly, and it allows us to move away from the expectation that if this is what it is right now, it will always stay this way. And I think that makes the relationship a lot more resilient and a lot more human, I think, like you were saying.
Yeah. And maybe one kind of final point is, in my perspective, labels are always reductionist. By definition, we're trying to kind of compress the continuous spectrum of life into a discrete spectrum of language and condense a lot of meaning into a term. And while there's nothing wrong with that, and it's incredibly useful, and that's why language is such a useful thing for us, right? We're able to communicate really complex things to each other through discrete, concrete language. I think it's important to know the limitations of that, which is you're replacing interaction with life as it is with interaction with labels and all of the pre-made assumptions that you have. And so I think, for example, if you think of, seeing land from a helicopter and seeing all the kind of differences in heights and all the vegetation and the buildings and the streets, you can kind of perceive all of that. But then suddenly if you look at a picture of it, then it becomes a lot more flat. And if you look at a map, then it reduces kind of the realism of the picture to even more kind of predefined, here's a street, here's a building. And so you lose definition as you kind of add more and more labels. And I think kind of idealistically for me, that is part of the reason I was saying in the beginning of the podcast, I would love to move away from labels, at least in my own head, because then I can interact with each individual situation or value and try to see it as a fresh new thing, as opposed to being like, oh, this falls into the
that
one of
box
100 categories that I've
yeah.
made for this situation. So
Yeah.
I'm going to interact with it the same way as before.
Yeah. Well, we made a full circle, so I feel like it's a good place to close.
Yeah. Well, let us know what you think about a slightly more conversational way of talking about a topic. And let us know if something resonated. We would love to hear back from you, whether it's an Instagram message or a comment. We would love to hear whether this lands with you. And until next time.
Until next time.